we go. Okay, so everyone can hear nice and clearly. And see the screen, I'm assuming, which will be a PowerPoint coming through on your webinar program. I feel like I should unmute you all just so we can have a little conversation, or I should have prepared some jokes or something. Anyway, I hope all is well at your end. Thanks for the encouragement. Seeing these little question bars come up. I'm just going to open and mute Jen. There we are. So it's 10 o'clock. We'll just wait another minute or so just to make sure everyone's on there okay. When I was asking my husband about a webinar, he just said, oh, well, people just mute their phone and go and do their thing. So hopefully the slides are dynamic enough. But if you are joining us by telephone, and I'll remind you in a moment as well, to just make sure your phone is on mute so it won't come through. So it's 10:01. I think we're going to get started. I want to welcome everybody to this webinar on the proposed program framework for a regional aquatic invasive species program in the Canadian Columbia Basin. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this program today. Oh, my slide is not going forward. It was working a minute ago. Oh, there we are. So I'd like to thank the Columbia Basin Watershed Network very much for hosting this webinar today. The primary goal of this webinar is to introduce stewardship groups like yourselves to this proposed AIS, or Aquatic Invasive Species Program for the Basin, and provide you with an opportunity for feedback. So this framework is in its draft form because your input and guidance is extremely valuable. So if you have any questions or comments or changes or suggestions, we'll have plenty of time at the end of the webinar to send your questions through. You can use the little questions box rather than the chat box. So just focus on that questions box, whether it's a question or a comment. And Jennifer Vogel with the Central Kootenay Invasive Plant Committee will be taking those questions, and then I'll open up her voice at the end so she can send them through. We were originally going to do this input session as a conference call, but realized there might be a lot of participants, and we were right since there's over 45 registered, I think, today. So I know that a webinar may not be the most suitable method for feedback and discussion, but we'll do our best today, and I'll also be providing you with my contact information. So you can always email or call me after the webinar with further input. The webinar should take the presentation part about 30 to 35 minutes. So again, we'll have lots of time at the end for your input. Just a few logistics before we begin. You should have all had access to this document. If you didn't, you can copy and paste that Dropbox link, or there's a little camera icon on your upper right-hand screen that you can click, and that does a screenshot, and apparently you can take the link from there. So this is my contact information if you want to get in touch with me after the webinar, and I'll show that at the end again. So if you do have comments or questions during the webinar, please type them into the questions box only, not the chat box, so that Jennifer can get those organized. And just a reminder, if you're calling into this webinar by telephone, please put your phone on mute. We'll be asking everyone to enter their comments in the text box, so that also can be saved at the end, and if you want a question log, you can have that as well. And one other point I wanted to clarify, when we're talking about the Columbia Basin today, or the Basin, for the purposes of this webinar and program, we're talking about the Columbia Basin Trust area of operation. So that's the area of BC that includes the Columbia River, or water bodies that drain into the Columbia River prior to it leaving Canada. So it may not have been clear in the webinar invitation, and I realize this leaves out a piece of the basin in Canada, the Okanagan. So ideally this program we're focused on here will coordinate and work collaboratively with the programs in the Boundary and Okanagan as well. I know that most of you are coming from a background with invasive species or a perspective of stewardship groups. So I'm going to assume you know the basics of invasive species, but we're talking about non-native, highly competitive species that have high ecological, social, or economic potential impacts. So I'm just going to go over a few of the high priority aquatic invasive species. But if you do want a full presentation for your organization on invasive species, I encourage you to be in touch with your regional invasive species committee, and I'll be providing you with their contact information too. And they're usually happy to come and do a presentation to your group about invasive species. So invasive riparian plants grow at the edges of wetlands and waterways, and generally these species are introduced for horticultural purposes and hop the garden fence. So for example, yellow flag iris can form dense thickets which reduce biodiversity and impact bird and amphibian habitat and native plants in wetlands. And this is a picture of Melviana Pond, but the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area has been struggling to manage yellow flag iris for years, and they have over a kilometer-long swath of this species. Giant hogweed looks like the native cow parsnip on steroids. This plant has a phototoxin that can cause severe skin and eye irritation, so it's a health or a social impact concern. And invasive knotweeds, if you're from the West Kootenay, you'll know these well, form dense thickets that can impact wildlife corridors. And because the roots of these plants don't form the same kind of web as the roots of native plants do to hold soil, it can lead to soil erosion, reduced water quality, and fisheries habitat impacts as well. There's also invasive plants that are submerged, and these aquatic invasive plants are often introduced through the aquarium or water garden trade, sometimes by people dumping their aquarium water down the drain or into natural wetlands. And hydrilla is an example of one of these aquarium plants that's now considered to be one of the most troublesome aquatic weeds of water bodies in the world. And luckily we don't have that one yet in BC or even in Canada. It quickly forms dense mats that change water chemistry and temperature, outcompete native plants for nutrients and light, change wildlife use, and interfere with economic and recreational use of the waterways. Invasive fish, there's many non-native fish species in BC and the Basin which can be invasive. And one of the highest priority at the moment is northern pike, which is actually a native species to BC, but to northern BC and not the Columbia Basin. So they've been introduced illegally for fishing purposes. And they're voracious predators that can quickly become dominant in waters they invade. So you can see an example on the top right of the prey that a single pike can eat. They're just entering the region up the Columbia River from Washington and are found south of the Hugh Keenleyside Dam. So there's an active removal program at the moment. Jeremy Baxter is doing that through TEC. And last year they removed 163 pike, and they estimate the population to be 725. So you can just imagine the impact that's having on native fisheries. They have stomach contents when they're captured of native fish, particularly salmonids, as their primary prey. Another invasive vertebrate species is the American bullfrog. And again, they're voracious predators. They'll eat just about anything that fits in their mouth. So that may include insects or other small invertebrates, birds, small mammals, snakes, other frogs, including their own species, other smaller bullfrogs. And since most of our native frogs are very small, they're a bite-sized snack for bullfrogs. So once bullfrogs invade, it's followed by declines in native frog populations. Bullfrog tadpoles also impact native frog tadpoles because they compete for food and habitat. So this information is really disconcerting for the Columbia Basin, since bullfrogs are found just over the border from Creston. And where they're entering is right where the northern leopard frog breeding population is. And the northern leopard frogs are a red-listed species in BC and are on the federal endangered list. So there's big concerns about this species entering the basin. But the aquatic invasive species of most concern to most people in the basin are zebra and quagga mussels. These invasive mussels pose a significant threat to our freshwater ecosystems, and we have just the right conditions of calcium and temperature for establishment and reproduction of mussels. They threaten native ecosystems and fisheries because they're high-volume filter feeders. So they're significantly reducing the biomass of phytoplankton and other microorganisms in the aquatic environment. And they consume such large quantities, they remove this essential food source for native species. Their waste products also cause toxic algal blooms. And they can colonize on any solid surface, including the skin or shells of native aquatic species, such as native mussels. So they literally cause death by starvation by forming these mats of mussels on native species. And the ability to cling onto hard surfaces and form layers up to 15 centimeters thick means they can clog a variety of infrastructure, particularly water intake pipes. So this leads to increased maintenance costs of hydroelectric, domestic water, and industrial, agricultural, and recreational facilities pipes. For example, in one power plant in Michigan, the densities of zebra mussels were as high as 700,000 mussels per meter squared. And the diameters of the pipes were reduced by 2/3. So if mussels were to invade, the hydroelectric facilities would have to do a lot of retrofitting of their equipment plus annual maintenance to basically scrape these mussels off. And this potential impact is of extremely high concern in the Columbia Basin, where we have numerous hydroelectric facilities that could be impacted. And it also means, and this is great to know from a stewardship group perspective when you're talking to folks, that even if someone doesn't care about the ecological impacts of invasive species, or they don't even recreate in water bodies, they would still be directly affected because of the significant increases to hydro bills. So in other words, the introduction of invasive mussels to the basin would impact all of us. In the Okanagan, they did an economic analysis of what they predict it would cost if they were invaded by mussels, and they estimate it to be $42 million per year. So this sentiment was certainly shared in the Columbia Basin Trust's recent strategic planning process, where residents of the basin identified invasive species as a high priority for environmental action, and particularly the zebra and quagga mussels. To determine how best to deliver on that goal, the Columbia Basin Trust looked to the regional invasive plant committees that are established in the basin. So regional committees cover most of the province of BC now, and most are based on the nonprofit society model of a multi-stakeholder collaborative partnership. And although many of them are called plant committees still, most are also working on other invasive species now, and particularly taking on the zebra and quagga mussel issue. So in the Columbia Basin, there are 4 regional committees within the Columbia Basin Trust area. So that's the Central Kootenay Invasive Plant Committee in the West Kootenay, the East Kootenay Invasive Plant Council, the Columbia Shuswap Invasive Species Society, and only the Columbia portion of their regional area is within the trust area, and the Northwest Invasive Plant Council, and just a small finger of their region, which encompasses the Kinbasket Reservoir, is in the Columbia Basin Trust area. So a collaborative partnership was formed between these 4 regional committees and the Columbia Basin Trust with the goal of developing a basin-wide aquatic invasive species program. And that was last fall. To guide this process, an aquatic invasive species steering committee was struck by the Trust, and that included many different organizations and perspectives that were represented, including local and provincial government, industry, First Nations, educational institutions, stewardship group, and regional committees. So I was hired by this collaborative partnership to bring together the information and ideas from all of these organizations and backgrounds and turn them into a streamlined, coordinated program framework that many different organizations could work from. And my contract goes until May 15th, and then this program will be handed over to this regional committee and basin-wide initiative. So the purpose really is to promote a proactive, strategic, collaborative, and coordinated approach to aquatic invasive species prevention and management in the basin. Basically meaning that we're all on the same page in our AIS activities, that we're not duplicating the efforts of others, but rather enhancing each other's activities. We're all working towards shared goals and priorities. And who's it for? It's for the basin-wide program, the regional committees, and local partners such as stewardship groups like yourselves. So the program framework and the program itself is focused around 5 program areas. The first program area addresses the question of who is doing what and what are the priority species. So that's coordination and collaboration. The second and third is how do we prevent these species from getting here. So that's the outreach and prevention area and the watercraft inspection and decontamination. The fourth is how do we know if they are here and what do we need to know to address them, and that's monitoring and research. And finally, the fifth is what do we do if they actually get here, and that's response and management. So I'm going to go through the highlights of each of these program areas, and they're in much more detail in that document if you want to give it a more thorough read. So the first program area is focused around coordination and collaboration. There are many organizations doing aquatic invasive species work in the basin and beyond, and we want the program to ensure coordination of these efforts rather than duplication. So one of the primary background questions we asked was who is doing what for AIS in the basin. And you may have received an email or a call from Kalish Fraser, who works with the Central Kootenay Invasive Plant Committee. She was gathering that information from stewardship groups. We also looked at province-wide and provincial initiatives and neighboring jurisdictions like Idaho and Alberta to get some ideas. The plan provides the context for the program based on what these other groups are doing, particularly the provincial government and province-wide initiatives and responsibilities. So for example, the provincial government recently released a number of documents, including an early detection and rapid response, or EDRR, plan for BC for zebra and quagga mussels, as well as an EDRR plan for other invasive species in the province. They also just released their invasive species strategic plan from a provincial government perspective. And you may have also heard their announcement that they'll be having mandatory boat inspection stations, 3 of these roving boat inspection stations in BC starting this summer, as well as putting up a lot of billboards and signage on the provincial border. So they've been active. The Invasive Species Council of BC is another province-wide initiative. It's a non-profit society, and it's the secretariat for a multi-stakeholder provincial strategy. And they also run provincial programs or province-wide programs such as Clean Drain Dry or Be Plant Wise Grow Me Instead. Regional committees have varying degrees of activities in aquatic invasive species, so this framework will help assist with the coordination of that. And then there's all the on-the-ground regional partners such as yourselves who do a variety of AIS work in outreach, monitoring, and treatments. So just trying to make sure we're all working together. So these are the goals under the coordination and collaboration portion of the framework, and primarily to establish a coordinated program and facilitate coordinated priorities and activities. This program will be guided by an aquatic working group, so that will be comprised of representatives from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives, including stewardship groups. And the recommendation is that the regional committees will act as the go-to organizations for AIS in the basin. So they'll maintain a list of the various organizations and who's doing what and what the activities are, and they'll really be promoting collaborative proposals and partnerships. The second area of activity is outreach and prevention. So outreach is an important part of any invasive species program, particularly for prevention, because aquatic invasive species usually arrive by human-assisted pathways. And you can see, looking at this diagram, a number of different pathways of how these species can arrive, from the kids putting their frogs in to a boat being launched, or you can just see all the different ways that aquatic invasive species can arrive in a water body. So this program framework identifies the main priority pathways that will be the focus of outreach and education. And those include water recreation, so boating, fishing, diving, horticulture and water garden trade, the aquarium, school, and pet trade, so people releasing crayfish or frogs or what have you, intentional unauthorized introductions, so illegal fish stocking, agency restoration activities, and industrial marine works. So folks using equipment and gear between water bodies. So that can be machinery, or it can be...
Lost audio. It's Jennifer speaking.
We just lost audio?
Yeah, you dropped us there.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yeah. Could somebody please type in a chat if they can hear Juliet as well? Okay, Wendy says she can hear you now.
Okay. Did you lose me just now, or do I need to go back a bit?
Okay.
Oh, and Katie didn't lose audio.
It looks like other people didn't lose audio.
Okay, I wonder what happened there. I'll try not to be dynamically active in my chair here.
Thanks, everybody.
So that's folks like you that might be doing stewardship or monitoring work between waterways, as well as people who build docks or move gear between water bodies. And finally, float planes we also are targeting as an outreach pathway for movement of species between water bodies. So the outreach component of the program is based on these pathways, not on particular species. So it's not like the program will focus on milfoil and mussels. It will focus on these actual pathways of introduction. And a clear behavior is identified for each target audience, for each pathway with a clear message. So the steering committee felt it was really important to have a consistent message within the region and also across the borders. So they looked at several message options for boaters, including don't move a mussel, which is used in the Okanagan and elsewhere in North America, stop aquatic hitchhikers, which has been used frequently, and take action, clean, drain, dry. And for a variety of reasons, they selected the key message, protect our waters, clean, drain, dry. So that will be the main key message that will be used in the basin for this program. And it's consistent with Alberta and Idaho and other portions of BC. And the goal is to have this message consistently used in outreach, including signs, brochures, presentations, etc. So ideally, stewardship groups will use the same message in your outreach materials as well. And you can switch that to protect our fisheries, protect our beaches, but we're really trying to get the clean, drain, dry message across. And regional committees have sign templates that if your stewardship group or organization wants to put up signs, you're encouraged to contact them and work from the same template. The steering committee also selected messages for other audiences that are consistent with the ISC, or the Invasive Species Council of BC. And this includes plant-wise, aimed at the horticultural trade. And it's waiting final approval, but it's looking like don't let it loose will be the main key message for the pet and aquarium trade, and potentially also for illegal fisheries introductions. So the other goals for outreach and education are listed here. And the one that directly relates to stewardship groups is the goal 3, to engage stewardship groups and others in AIS outreach. So if your organization is already involved in AIS outreach or would like to be, or is involved in outreach for other water stewardship or other related topics, and could potentially include the AIS messaging, there may be opportunities to collaborate with your regional committee and share resources, coordinate events, coordinate activities, etc. The third program area focuses on watercraft inspection and decontamination as another method of preventing aquatic invasive species from arriving in the basin in the first place. So this program area is primarily aimed at zebra and quagga mussel prevention, but if you do clean, drain, dry your boat, then you will prevent any other species from arriving as well, any other aquatic hitchhikers from watercraft before they enter our waters. So this slide shows the spread of invasive mussels over time. So mussels were accidentally introduced into the Great Lakes in the 1980s through bilge water, and in the 80s and 90s they moved within naturally connected waterways. So because the veligers, which are the mussel larvae, are free-floating for up to 2 months, they can spread down waterways. But in 2007, you can see a new set of dots in southwestern U.S., and then in 2013, other unconnected waterways becoming infested. So the only way they could have spread there is by transportation on a boat. So this map really highlights how human activity is responsible for the overland transport of mussels and the subsequent infestations of unconnected waterways. Adult mussels can survive for up to 30 days in locations where moisture is maintained, so they don't necessarily have to be immersed in water. and the larvae are free-floating and microscopic, so they can be unknowingly transported in any standing water or moisture, and that's where the clean, drain, dry slogan comes in. Watercraft are being moved constantly around North America. So if one mussel-infested watercraft enters the waters of the Columbia Basin, it can introduce mussels here. And this map shows the locations of where boats were from when they were stopped at only one watercraft inspection station in Idaho in 1 year. So you can see the long movement of watercraft from literally all over North America coming through this boat inspection station to Idaho. And then the green dots is where they're heading to. So you can clearly see that boats coming from mussel-infested water are heading to BC. The provincial government now has the authority to stop watercraft and inspect them for mussels under the new Wildlife Act Controlled Alien Species Regulation. So yay! The provincial government will have 3 units and crews for BC this summer, and 2 of those will be in the Columbia Basin, one roving across the Alberta border, because Lake Winnipeg has mussels, and the other will be along the U.S. border. So this program framework recommends enhancing these provincial government activities. The 4th program area is research and monitoring. So monitoring might be for veligers, these free-floating mussel larvae, as well as aquatic plants. And finding the veligers early means that there can be an early detection rapid response. By the time you've found mussels attached to a hard substrate, they've been there for a while. So there has been some veliger sampling occurring in 2012 and 2014, and you'll see it's primarily in the Central Kootenay Invasive Plant Committee region, and that's because they receive funding from the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program. But the goal would be to expand this monitoring network across the basin, and this is a great opportunity to engage with stewardship groups who are already out there doing water sampling. There's also been aquatic plant sampling, and the goal is to have a more thorough approach to that as well. So the parts of the program here that are really relevant to stewardship group includes the goal to promote a standardized monitoring, data sharing and reporting program. So using the same monitoring protocols, so everyone's using the same methodology, and data can be compared and critical data are being reported. So if you're interested in learning about what those standardized monitoring protocols are, you can contact your regional committee and they could potentially offer training workshops on those. Another goal is to increase opportunities to participate in the AIS monitoring. So as I say, there could be training workshops for your group or information about the provincial monitoring standards. This could look like a citizen science program that links high priority monitoring sites with nearby stewardship groups and that sort of thing. We were also trying a little bit in a brief way to identify what high priority waterways would be. How do we know if it's a high priority site? So a very small part of this framework was to identify a ranking matrix. So using proxies or a point system for clear factors. So for example, if the number of boat launches gives a certain number of points to that water body, whether or not it has a moorage, whether or not there's a water-based event like a fly fishing tournament or a wakeboarding tournament or something. And so that's in Appendix C of the framework, and it's in draft form at this point. But the idea would be that the whole region, the whole basin could be using the same ranking matrix, so if we would be very clear on where high priority water bodies are regardless of whose regional committee they're in. And another strong factor in ranking high priority for monitoring is where natural introductions of these species could occur. So we've got several waterways that flow into the basin from the U.S. and for example, flowering rush is coming down the Pend Oreille River from Washington. And there's a series of maps in the appendices of the document that demonstrate where aquatic invasive species are just outside the borders of our region. So what we should really be looking out for and potentially where we could be looking out for them. The 5th and final program area is response and management. So what do we do when these aquatic invasive species has arrived? And part of this is really to look at who is doing what or will do what. Often this is based on which species are the responsibility of the provincial government. So the response approach for each of these species groups is outlined in this program framework. The provincial government will take the lead on zebra and quagga mussels, and they have a provincial early detection rapid response strategy in place to do that. So the big message here is that if there's any suspected invasive mussels, you or encourage the person to call the RAP line immediately. So that's the Report All Poachers and Polluters line. So that will be used, and that will trigger conservation officers to come and deal with the suspected mussels. The provincial government's also revising its Weed Control Act regulations so that species are being categorized, and some species are being considered prohibited in BC. Those are the species that have high potential impacts in the province and are either not here yet in BC, or they're here in small enough amounts that they could potentially be eradicated. So if those species are detected, they'll be reported to the provincial government to take the lead on response. And in the framework, there's a link to what those species are. Regional committees will take the lead on aquatic and riparian plants that aren't on this prohibited list. Because regional committees don't have expertise in fish, they'll only be focusing on education around fish, the don't let it loose message. So management of fish will be done by the province, BC Hydro, compensation program, or others who are already involved in fisheries management. And with the bullfrogs, those are coming into potentially to the Creston area. So the Central Kootenay Invasive Plant Committee is working with the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, the provincial government, the Creston Wildlife Management Area, and other related folks for bullfrogs. And if any other unique species come in that way, then these little action teams would be formed around those species with relevant partners. So it's an exciting program, I think, for aquatic invasive species prevention and management in the basin. And there are many links to stewardship groups in the 5 program areas of coordination and collaboration, outreach and prevention, watercraft inspection and decontamination, research and monitoring, and response and management. So I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to hearing your questions and feedback in a moment. As I said, I wanted to keep the presentation part of this relatively short, so we have lots of time for that. But I want to also encourage you, before we get to questions, to connect with your regional committee if you haven't already, to discuss opportunities for collaboration or sharing resources and working together. The regional committees are working on developing a central repository for aquatic invasive species information. So we're not sure yet if that's going to be a web page or what it will look like. But if you do have any final reports or data or anything else related to aquatic invasive species, please pass it along to them. So send your questions, if you haven't already, through the questions tab. And if we don't get to your question today or there's more to discuss, do feel free to call me at this phone number here or email me. So Jennifer Vogel has the questions, and I'm going to get her to unmute herself so she can start posing your questions to me. Are you unmuted, Jen? There you are. Are you there, Jen?
Now I am, yep.
Okay.
I am. Can you hear me?
I am.
Okay, great.
I can.
So I've got, perfect. The first question here is from Sally Hammond. Where are we with the federal government regarding conscientious inspections for mussels at U.S. and Canadian borders?
Well, that's a very good question, and I wish Matthias Herborg was on this call. He is the Provincial Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the provincial government. So he's working with the federal government because they have this provincial legislation in place. Of course, we would love to have federal legislation in place that would allow border agents to stop boats and inspect them. At this point, he is waiting to, I think it's still in discussion, but ideally I think he's waiting for response in the next 4 to 6 weeks. But his prediction would be that the provincial government would take on that role because the border staff are quite maxed out already. So if you want to ask him that question, that would probably be a better route. And that's Matthias Herborg with the provincial government. Sorry, I can't answer that more specifically.
That's great. Thanks, Juliet. We've got another question here from Sally. How do boaters clean their boat motors properly? For example, when stopped by the roving inspection stations and/or just to be conscientious?
Okay, so the watercraft inspection stations, there are these decontamination units that are quite large devices that are self-contained with water, which means the water won't drain into a water body. And there are specific training methods that actually, Jennifer, you could better answer because you've taken them, and Kalish, and quite a few folks from regional committees have been down to Las Vegas and taken the watercraft inspection and decontamination training course, and the conservation officers themselves will also have taken that course. So it's a high pressure hot water unit that will kill anything that it comes into contact with and take the water out into a self-contained way. For non-mussel threats and typical boaters, one of the recommendations in the framework is to have a brochure that lets people know where their nearest water cleaning station would be that isn't hot water, so it wouldn't be a decontamination unit, but for example would prevent milfoil from spreading from the west to the East Kootenay. And Kalish Fraser with the Central Kootenay Invasive Plant Committee has researched a lot of the car wash, or all the car wash stations in the basin, and has put together information about which of those have self-contained water so that the water isn't just going to go down the drains into the lake. So ideally that brochure will be available in the coming months.
Great, thanks Juliet. I have another question here from Claire de La Salle. How does the former CKIPC Aquatics Working Group fit into all of this?
That's a very good question. So there was discussions at the steering committee level, and many of the aquatic working group members from the Central Kootenay Invasive Plant Committee were on the steering committee. And rather than each regional committee having their own aquatic working group, which would be comprised of very similar or the same person from many of the organizations, they've decided to have one aquatic working group. So that will be a discussion with the current CKIP Aquatic Working Group of who might wish to sit on this basin-wide aquatic working group, and of course that working group would need to be expanded to include perspectives from the Columbia and East Kootenay and Northwest as well.
Thanks, Juliet. I have another question here from Sally. What possibilities are there for getting rid of American bullfrogs once they arrive?
You're asking me all the tough ones, Sally. Well, I'm certainly no expert in bullfrog control, but I know in other parts of the province they use electroshock, so they basically stun all the amphibians and then they physically remove the bullfrogs and kill them in a humane way, apparently. So that is a discussion that's definitely happening between the provincial government. It's ultimately their responsibility of how they see bullfrog removal. To how it would occur. It would be under their permits and their jurisdiction and their legal authority. And that question hasn't needed to be put on the ground in the basin yet because bullfrogs have not yet been detected. Jennifer Vogel was involved with others in doing some acoustic monitoring for bullfrogs last year, and none were detected to date.
Great, thanks Juliet. We have another bullfrog question here from Wendy Horan. How bad is the problem south of the border, and is it as bad as the lower mainland and the island?
That's a very good question, Wendy, and again, I'm not an expert on bullfrogs. I do know that they're quite thick from Box Lake all the way up to Medellin Falls, that they're not even attempting to control necessarily because it is out of hand now. So I don't know how that compares to Victoria and Vancouver, which also have extensive bullfrog problems. But I do know from the current information we have that eradication would be feasible if we have an early detection, rapid response action.
I'm just going to go through the questions here again, Juliet, make sure I've got everybody. Okay, we've got a question here from Hans. Dumarauf, has a mussel monitoring station been established on the Arrow Lakes area?
I wonder if I can unmute Kalish for that. Let me just see if I can find you, Kalish, because you're really a great person to be answering these types of questions. Not to put you on the spot, but you are now unmuted, Kalish.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Yes.
Oh, there's feedback, though, or something. Oh, there we are. Oh, I'm hearing water running.
I'm not running water.
There you go. Now you sound better.
Do I sound okay?
Oh, I'm getting some pretty bad feedback, but we'll attempt that.
Can I put my answer into the question box?
That might be better. We can also look at this map, if we go back, the map of where the villager sampling has occurred. Here we are, not to make you all dizzy. There, that's where the villager sampling has occurred, so it looks like there has been sampling done in the Arrow Lakes there. Upper Arrow, Lower Arrow, and Slocan Lake. And perhaps you can pass any other information through the questions box there.
Okay, so Kalish just responded yes, that there was sampling that occurred in Nakusp and at Syringa in 2014. And Hans, that work will continue into 2015 as well, and Kalish will be getting in touch with you from the CKIT perspective. Okay, I'm just going to do another quick review here. It looks like we've answered all of the questions, and there is nothing left in the chat box.
Okay. If you did want to provide more feedback on the document itself, take a closer look at the action items, see if you feel like there's any pieces missing or anything that could be added or anything that doesn't make sense to you from a stewardship group perspective, that would be great. I'll be doing the final wrap-up in the first week of May to get this document in its finalized form. But it is a living document, so one of the action items in the actual document itself is to update it annually based on new information and what's working and what's not working. So this was short and sweet, and I really appreciate your attendance and your feedback and all the work that you folks do on the ground. And I look forward to a really exciting and active aquatic invasive species program. I also want to thank the Columbia Basin Watershed Network for hosting this webinar today. And it will be recorded, so if you know anyone who wanted to attend and couldn't, you can encourage them to go to the Columbia Basin Watershed Network website, and the webinar should be posted in about a week or so. So with that, I think we can sign off unless I'm going to unmute Tara as well. If you had
Unmuted.
Tara from the Columbia Basin Watershed Network, or Jennifer, or anybody else there.
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. It's very funny because my other phone started to ring at the same moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And I hope you know how to sign out. I'm not too sure.
I'll
Bye
handle that part. Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.